Volume pedals are a tool that are sort of a necessary evil in the arsenal of every guitar player. It's something that we often use to manipulate the volume of the guitar without actually having to physically touch the pot on the guitar, or depending on where we place it, might even use that for a master volume of some kind, either to attenuate the preamp of our amplifier or to attenuate distortion and overdrive pedals that are coming before a volume pedal. Today, we're going to talk about everything volume pedals regarding the placement, where it's optimal, and the types of volume pedals that you might want to get depending on where you like your volume pedal in your signal path. Now, before we get into the specifics of volume pedals, I want to remind you to subscribe. And if you think that you're subscribed already, I highly recommend you to double check and verify that, because only about 20% of the people that are watching our videos week to week are actually subscribed. The best way to support us, of course, is to subscribe, hit the bell icon. That way you stay up to date with all the new videos that we're releasing every single week. Now back to volume pedals. So let's just quickly define first what a volume pedal is. So just like how we have a volume pot in most of our guitars that will either bring up the volume or attenuate and bring down the volume, a volume pedal is essentially the same thing. It's an input jack that then feeds a potentiometer to an output jack. There can also often be a parallel jack off of the input, which is usually reserved for a tuner output. We'll talk a little bit more on those later in the video. Typically, we see two different values of potentiometers that are wired into a volume pedal. It's either 250K, which is pretty representative of most Fender style guitars and many others that are out there, and the other value that we see is 25K. And these are typically designated as high impedance and low impedance. The high impedance being the 250K version and the low impedance being the 25K version. Now, most major brands make versions of low and high impedance volume pedals, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the video. But there's also something called an active volume pedal, which means that it is powered and has a buffer on board. And we'll also talk about those throughout the video so that you understand the difference between high impedance, low impedance, and active volume pedals and where you might want to put them. Now let's first talk about what's considered a high impedance volume pedal. An example of a high impedance volume pedal that we're going to be using today is the Dunlop Volume X. Now there's tons of makes and models of high impedance volume pedals, and I would argue they're the most common of all the volume pedals out there. Most companies that are making one at least have one of these, if not a few other impedances as well, but this is typically the one that you're going to see most often in most guitar stores. If you walk into a Guitar Center or a Thomann or wherever it is that you're buying your equipment from, this is what you're going to see when you walk into the store, most likely as the most common volume pedals. It's either going to be a Dunlop Volume X, something like an Ernie Ball VP Jr. The standard version is a 250K, a Boss FV500H. The high impedance Boss is going to be another example of a 250K pot inside of a volume pedal. Again, this is the most common and most typical. The second type of volume pedal that you see is a low impedance volume pedal, and I have an older Boss FV300L, the predecessor to the current Boss version FV500L. And L just stands for low impedance, so that you know if you were going to go buy a volume pedal, if it has the L designation, that's a 25K pot, and if it has the H designation, then you know it's a 250K pot. Typically on Boss pedals, all of the L versions or low impedance versions were almost always stereo, and that's why you see there's so many more jacks on this than a lot of the other volume pedals that you might recognize. But like I had said a little earlier, most companies make high and low impedance versions of most of their volume pedals, including companies like Ernie Ball. Here's an Ernie Ball active volume pedal, and they call it active not because this is powered, and I know that that's a little bit confusing. They call it active because I think their intent was that they use these with active pickups that basically have a buffer already inside of them, and the lower impedance is optimized for that lower output impedance signal. This has a 25K pot. It looks almost identical to the 250K version, and the only way you can really tell the difference is on the front. It actually indicates that it's 25K, so just keep your eye out for that if you are going to buy one of the specific types that we talk about today, that you're identifying whether it's an active or a passive one based on the value that it says on the front, or whether it says H for high impedance or L for low impedance like it would on a Boss pedal. Now the third type of volume pedal that we're going to talk about today is an active volume pedal. Now as I said earlier, with active volume pedals, this is putting some sort of buffer inside the volume pedal to help deal with some of the tone suck that's normally associated with passive volume pedals. Again, buffering that potentiometer so that you have a nice smooth taper and you don't have any consequence to having, let's say, another volume pot in series with the rest of your rig. Now, normally you're seeing mostly passive volume pedals. Active volume pedals tend to be few and far between, although a really great one, if you do want to go that direction as we get into some of the examples here, I think is the Lely volume pedal. It has a very high quality buffer, whether you're using it first in your chain or later on in the chain, as we'll discuss as different pedal orders that might exist for you in your volume pedal. The Lely's probably the best mechanically built and again has the best buffer. Not all pedals that have buffers built into them, as we've said many times before, mean that it has a good quality buffer. The Lely is one of those exceptions and does have a great quality buffer and again is very well built. If you do decide to go with an active volume pedal, that would be a great choice. Another option as well, if you want to go with an active volume pedal, the Vertex Boost actually has an expression jack on the back of it. Both version 2, as I have here, or version 1 have this of the Vertex Boost, and you can put any passive volume pedal inside of the Vertex Boost and turn it into an active volume pedal. So if you like a sweep or a taper of your old Ernie Ball or your old Boss pedal, you can connect it to the expression jack on this, and you can use it the exact same way as it would be if it were a normal volume pedal, except it's isolated through the loop of the expression inside the boost. And when you hit the boost foot switch and you're boosting the signal, it'll also allow you to control that boosted volume as well. And then when you hit the foot switch again, it just goes back to being a normal volume pedal again. But this is a good way to turn your passive volume pedal into an active one. If you want some of those features, you also use a boost and you love the kind of classic taper of, again, a Boss or an Ernie Ball style volume pedal, this could be a good alternative as well. Now that we've identified some of the most common types of volume pedal, active, passive, high impedance at 250K, and passive low impedance at 25K, let's talk about ideal places to put some of these volume pedals and actually show you some examples of how they might sound in these particular conditions. I think the first most common way that we see people use volume pedals is putting them right up front. Guitar goes directly into the volume pedal, and then the volume pedal feeds the rest of the pedals on their pedal boards. Now, this is one way to do it. I would say that this is going to be beneficial to a person that not only wants to control their volume, but concurrently wants to be able to control the gain and saturation of their signal. Because this volume pedal is going to be working in essence exactly the same as the volume pot on their guitar, just as when you have a high gain distortion pedal on and you start to roll back your volume knob, it's going to start to not only reduce the amount of output, but it's also going to start to clean up the signal to a degree. And different pedals do this more or less to a better or worse degree depending on the quality and the design of the pedal. But volume pedals are going to act the exact same way as the volume pot on board your guitar would act. So as you turn it down, it's going to lower the volume, but it's also going to change the gain structure. Now, this can be great, again, for some players, but there is a consequence to that in that it's duplicating something that you already have. And if you're using a passive volume pedal, you're most likely going to get some degree of tone suck because you have a volume pot in series with another volume pot, and you just have your passive pickups in most cases to drive that cable going into that volume pedal. So you don't really have a quality line drive or any sort of buffering that's going into that volume pedal. So you are going to get some loss, you are going to get some loading, and likely some roll off as well. What you're going to hear in this example is I'm going to back the volume pedal off a little bit so that you can hear how it sounds when it's a little bit more cleaned up. And then I'll kind of replay the same passage and kind of swell into it a little bit more. So you get to hear the gain differences between the volume backed off slightly as I start, where it's a little cleaner. And then as I ramp up, it's not only getting louder, but it's going to get more distorted at the same time. Let's hear how it sounds. I'm going to have my PRS 513. I'm going to go directly into the Dunlop Volume X, and then that's going to feed a tube screamer for some of my gain. I'm going to then be feeding the front of a Fender Hot Rod DeVille ML. This is going to be mic'd with an SM7B microphone underneath my house with a G1265 speaker, and I'm going to be running some delay and reverb from a J-Rocket Audio Clockwork delay and a RV7 reverb from Digitech. So as you heard there, it was affecting two things at once. It was not only affecting the output of the actual guitar volume, but it was also affecting the gain structure the exact same way that it would affect it if I just rolled up or down my volume control on my actual guitar. So there is some redundancy in that. Also, you're going to have some amount of tone suck because you have your volume pot here, passive pickups driving a passive volume pedal. This might make this particular position of your volume pedal, if you decide that you like it up front and controlling those two variables of saturation and volume at the same time, to actually use something like the Lely volume pedal that we recommend, where it puts a buffer inside of the volume pedal. So it's not only loading the guitar pickups correctly, just like a high quality buffer would, but it's allowing you to have a reliable and robust volume pedal right up front that can still have the same controls, but it's not going to have any of the consequences of the tone suck. You're getting a good buffer. It's going to be able to drive that line not only through the volume pedal, but through the rest of your rig until you reach presumably your output buffer at the end of the signal path. If you did want to run something this way, I wouldn't recommend putting a passive volume pedal up front. Even if it is matched right impedance-wise with the 250K pod up front, I would still say an active volume pedal is going to be preferable. Or you could use something like our Vertex Boost if you really like the feel or the sound or the taper of your existing Ernie Ball or Dunlop or whatever passive volume pedal it might be if you like running it up in front. So let's now go to another option as far as a place to put your volume pedal. And this would be moving it further down in the chain after your overdrive and distortion pedals, but before any time-based or modulation pedals. So let's go through the signal path here for this. I have my 513 guitar. It's going into my pedal board. My pedal board has a tube screamer, then it goes into my volume pedal, and then it feeds a J-Rocket Audio clockwork delay. It's also going to feed a Boss Wazacraft Dimension C, and it's going to feed a Hardwire RV7 reverb. Those are all going to be in stereo. This is all running into my Hot Rod DeVille ML, and all the stereo effects are running after the microphone in post. What you're going to hear in this example is as I back down the volume, it's not going to change the structure or the gain of the overall tone. It's going to act exactly the same way as a master volume would on my amp, where I walk back, I turn it up, I turn it down. It's going to react the exact same way, except I'm going to have those reverb and delay trails and chorus coming all after the volume pedal. So those still get to travel out and still get to decay, but all the gain sounds are going to be attenuated as though I'm turning up and down the volume on the actual amplifier. So let's check that out. Let's hear some examples of what this sounds like, again, with the volume pedal after the distortion, in this case, using a tube screamer. And for this, I'm going to use my 25K Ernie Ball low impedance volume pedal because it is being fed an active signal, because not only do I have a buffer up front in my signal path, but I'm also feeding a tube screamer into it, which is converting the signal to low impedance. Maybe not as good as my individual buffer might, but it's low enough to be able to drive that 25K pot. So you've heard here what happens when you have the volume pedal after your overdrive and distortion section. What you got to hear was as I rolled back, it attenuated the volume, but didn't change the amount of distortion or saturation. And of course, we still had all those delay, reverb, and chorus trails trailing off behind it. And I find that this is the best place to really use a passive volume pedal, or active volume pedal for that matter, if you're running everything in front of the amp. The reason being is I can still attenuate and be able to change the structure of gain by using the volume pot on my guitar. But I can't use the guitar volume pot as a master volume. When I'm using that volume pedal after the distortion pedals, I can use that as my master volume. And if I want to change the gain structure, I can do it on my guitar. It gives me the most flexibility and doesn't make a redundancy by having a volume pedal right after my volume pot and my output jack on my guitar. I think that if you're running everything in front of an amplifier, this is the best way to do it. But let's now talk about a third way to do it, which is using your effects loop as a place to put the volume pedal. For my signal path to use the volume pedal in the effects loop, I'm going to have my 513 going into my pedal board. It's going to hit all of my overdrive and distortion devices, all my dry effects. That's going to feed the front of the amp. Then the effects send out of the effects loop is going to feed my volume pedal. Then it's going to feed the J-Rocket Audio Clockwork, the Dimension C, the Boss RV7, and then go back into the return. So basically I'm putting the volume pedal right after the effects loop send. So not only is this acting as a master volume for the preamp in my actual amplifier by way of putting it after the effects loop send, it's also acting the same way as it would if it were after my overdrive and distortion pedals in front of an amplifier like we just demonstrated. I think that this is the best way to do it if you have an amplifier that is high gain, that does do some amount of channel switching. It's going to give you the best possible results, because if I were to put the volume pedal in front, as I had done in the previous example, and I'm using a lot of gain, the gain in the amp is acting the same way as a distortion pedal. So in essence, you're putting the volume pedal back to how it was in the first example, where it's before your overdrive and distortion. The one catch, though, to using a volume pedal in the effects loop is that most volume pedals won't work. Generally, the ones that you want to go for are the low impedance volume pedals. Something like the Ernie Ball 25K would be a great candidate, perhaps the Boss FV500L, or even the Boss FV300L like I have here. In this example, I'm going to stick with my Ernie Ball active volume pedal, even though it's passive, they call it active for some reason, with the 25K pot. So you can hear what that sounds like. You're going to hear that we're going to get beautiful trails. We're still going to get all that reverb and delay behind it, but it doesn't have any of the consequences of the distortion element of the amplifier affecting how the volume pedal is working as a master volume, nor is it going to affect any of the distortion effects. Let's hear how this sounds. So I think that sounds great. If you have an amplifier that is producing gain as a channel switching amplifier, undoubtedly using it after the effects send, I think, is the most advantageous way to use it. Now, you could, in this case, also use an active volume pedal if you wanted to have the benefits of the buffer, and that can also help address some of the impedance issues that can exist in a lot of the effects loops. Again, amp to amp, everyone is different. There are no standards for effects loops. Equally, you could use something like the Vertex Boost if you wanted to take your volume pedal that maybe is not so optimal for your effects loop, but you want to have a boost and you want to be able to maintain the taper that you like of your favorite volume pedal. You can just put it in the expression loop of the Vertex Boost and have a full use of it, just as though it were any other volume pedal that would ordinarily work with your favorite amplifier. Now, to recap, we talked about a couple of different styles of volume pedals. We talked about active volume pedals, again, the powered ones that have buffers inside of them, or something like our Vertex Boost that turns a passive volume into an active one. We also talked about high impedance volume pedals like the classic Ernie Ball, the Boss FV500H, the Dunlop Volume X, all being great choices for high impedance volume pedals. We also talked about low impedance volume pedals. Boss makes one called an FV500L. I showed you its earlier incarnation, the FV300L that I have here. Also, the Ernie Ball 25K versions are all examples of volume pedals that are designed for low impedance. In most circumstances on your pedal board, if you're running a buffer, you want to use the low impedance volume pedal, not the high impedance volume pedal. The only time that you may want to use a high impedance volume pedal is if the guitar is plugging directly into it and you're not using any sort of signal conditioning or buffering. That would be acceptable to use first, although there is going to be some tone suck and some consequence to that. If you're using your volume pedal in the effects loop, you definitely want to use a lower impedance volume pedal or some sort of active volume pedal to compensate for the unknown impedance of the effects loop. If you want to use a volume pedal first, it's going to do a great job of emulating exactly what the guitar volume pot does. When you roll it down, it's going to clean up and it's going to lower the volume. If you put it after your overdrive and distortion pedals, it's going to act as a master volume as though you're turning up and down your amplifier volume, but you get those beautiful delay and reverb trails coming through even though you've cut off the volume. Equally, if you're running it into the effects loop and you're using a high gain amp or a channel switching amp, it's also going to act as a master volume, give you those beautiful trails, but also allow you to, again, bring up or bring down the amount of volume, just like a master volume, but not have any consequence to cleaning up the amount of gain. Last thing before we complete today is I want to talk about tuner outs on passive volume pedals, because this is something that comes up, but is not something that's the primary core of what our video is about today. The bottom line rule is don't use the tuner out if you have a passive volume pedal. It is a parallel load, which means that in essence, when the guitar comes into the volume pedal, it splits off of that input jack and sends it out to your actual tuner from there. And if there is no signal conditioning going on that's actually driving that parallel load, it is going to affect your signal adversely, and you would be better off putting your tuner in series with the volume pedal as opposed to running it out of the tuner out. Again, if you have an active volume pedal or some sort of buffered volume pedal, this is not going to be a problem. But if you just have an ordinary passive volume pedal and it's right up front, there's no signal conditioning, you do not want to use the tuner out. Equally, if it's in the middle of your signal path and you don't have any specific signal conditioning that's running right before that volume pedal, you do not want to use the tuner out. If you have an active volume pedal, however, feel free to use the tuner out. So the bottom line is don't use a tuner out unless you have an active volume pedal. You can do the test yourself, but trust me, it is the best way to go to just put the tuner in series with the volume pedal. Using that tuner out is going to have consequential ramifications. Just don't do it. Friends don't let friends use their tuner outs on passive volume pedals. So that was our long-winded explanation of volume pedals. You got to hear about different placements that you could use it in. You got to hear about different versions of volume pedals. Again, it's all about personal preference. Do you want it to act as a master volume, in which case you'd use it in your effects loop or after your overdrives? Do you want it to act just like your guitar volume pot, in which case you put it first? We talked about active and passive, low and high impedance. I gave you some examples of different volume pedals that are out there that I like. So definitely do check those out. I'm going to link all the volume pedals that we spoke about in the description below. Again, today for most of my examples, I was using the Ernie Ball low impedance 25K version. I also did use the Dunlop Volume X for the high impedance version where I was plugging the guitar directly into it. But otherwise, all the other ones we spoke about, I've just either shown examples of or we've shown examples on the screen, but those again will all be listed in the links below. If you enjoyed the video today, I highly recommend give us a thumbs up, leave us a comment, tell us about maybe some other volume pedals that you think work really great in sort of the active category or some of the other passive categories, or different versions of high and low impedance volume pedals that perhaps we didn't mention that you think are really great options. We'd love to hear from you on that. And if you want to support us, an easy way to do that is you could join us over on Patreon. We have memberships as low as $1 a month. I also offer one-on-one consulting over on therigdr.com, as well as all of the kind of cables, Velcro, zip ties, tie-down mounts, all the stuff that we use to build rigs and that we use to connect everything, including the pedals that we use today. It's all available on therigdr.com. Or you could purchase a pedal from us, like the Vertex Boost, which we talked about today, is a great way to isolate and to make an active volume pedal out of any passive volume pedal. You can grab that over from one of our dealers. Again, those are all listed on our website. And a free way to engage with us in a longer form discussion is to go over to our podcast on all the common podcatchers, which is Chairman of the Boards, where me, Brian O'Million, and Grant Klassen from Goodwood Audio and from O'Million Audio all get together and have a weekly roundtable discussion on tone and pedal boards. And I think you'll really dig it if you enjoyed this video. Until next time, I'm Mason Marangella, aka The Rig Doctor. We'll see you later.